Welcome to the Latino Business Report. In this episode, we're diving into a pressing issue: the increasing number of children coming to the United States in search of safety and a better life. Statistics show that around 140,000 children are apprehended at the U.S.-Mexican border each year. Experts estimate that for every child apprehended, 3 more successfully make it into the country. Our guest today is Stephanie Canzales, a researcher, author, and professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Canzales also serves as faculty director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migrant Initiative. Her book, Sin Padres ni Papeles, Unaccompanied Migrant Youth Coming of Age in the United States, is a powerful collection of personal interviews that reveal the harrowing journeys of these young migrants. Tune in and listen to some of the stories of the children who dared to undertake this dangerous trek to the United States alone.
Welcome to the Latino Business Report. This podcast covers business, people, and issues of the day from a Latino perspective. The Latino Business Report is brought to you by TAMAC, the Texas Association of Mexican American Chambers of Commerce. TAMAC is the leading Hispanic business organization in Texas since 1975. Now for your host, J.R. Gonzalez.
And welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a subject not many people talk about. We hear a lot about immigration. We hear a lot about undocumented immigration of people coming across, crossing countries, crossing through Mexico, coming out of Central America into the United States to try to find a better way of life. But one of the things we don't talk much about is the children, the unaccompanied children who actually make that journey on their own, the perils that they face, the dangers that they face, and what happens to them once they get here. Today, our guest is Dr. Stephanie Canzales. She's an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Stephanie, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Stephanie, thank you for making the time. I want to say that I am reading your book. It's a slow process. There's not many pictures, but I've really enjoyed what I've been reading so far, and it's very interesting. The name of your book is, what is it?
Sin Padres ni Papeles, Unaccompanied Migrant Youth Coming of Age in the United States.
And for those who do not speak God's language, that basically translate without parents and without papers.
Yep, without parents nor papers, yeah.
And what is the subtitle? The Unaccompanied Migrant Youth Coming of Age in the United States. As we look at this, immigration is a big issue. It's a big issue in politics. It's a big issue in business. I mean, everybody's talking about it. But as I said, as we were talking, not many people consider the youth. What got you interested in doing an entire book focused on the children that are crossing over?
Yeah, you're totally right. When we do talk about immigrant youth, it's usually in the context of their relationship to a parent that is at risk of deportation or family separation, right? Children in relation to adults. Or when I started to study this topic, it was really focused, the immigration debate and social science research was really focused on students, undocumented or children.
Yeah, the DACA students and the dreamers.
DACA, dreamer, or children of immigrants navigating, language at school that is different from language at home, something like that, right? Again, children assumed to be in the context of a parent-led household or the protective institution of schools. So when I came across in 2012, I came across this group of unaccompanied, undocumented youth garment workers, born and raised in LA. I started my PhD program at USC in Los Angeles and thought I was going to study undocumented students. That's what I was interested in looking into at the time, the coming of age of undocumented youth in that sense. Mm-hmm. But this group of garment workers, sort of threw me for a loop as someone who had grown up in LA, but didn't realize there were factories sewing clothes for Old Navy and Banana Republic and J. Crew in central Los Angeles, right? And then also as the daughter of immigrants who both Salvadoran immigrants, and I hadn't really considered that there were children as young as 7, 8, 9 years old. Again, I'm in 2012, right? Like the crisis of unaccompanied child migration didn't hit until 2014. So I didn't really have a frame of really understanding unaccompanied child migration. And it just occurred to me that you aren't, if you are an unaccompanied, undocumented young person, you're outside of the bounds of childhood as we know it.
Hmm.
You're not in schools. Where are your, how are you going through everything from puberty to making friends to paying rent, right? The
Right.
full spectrum of survival as an adolescent. So I just really
And
leaned
and
into that.
without parents, I mean, how do you learn that? I mean, or
How do you learn it? Yeah.
you find a role model, or just learn the hard way on the streets. I mean, I can imagine I can only imagine. I can't imagine. I can only imagine being, 14, 15 years old, striking out on your own, crossing, thousands of miles, coming into a country where you don't speak the language, are unfamiliar with how to survive, and then
Yeah.
just trying to carve out a life for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
About how many children, and let's, for sake of this podcast, call them children because they are. About how many children come over a year? Do you know?
Yeah, so since I mentioned 2014 as the onset of the humanitarian crisis, since 2014, about 750,000 children have been apprehended at the US-Mexico border as unaccompanied minors. Um, yeah,
Seven
that
hundred seven
started,
hundred fifty thousand.
yes,
That's
and
that's
that,
who they've
so
that's who they've apprehended. Not to mention how many actually made it through.
right. So in the book, I talk about children who are not apprehended at the border. So there's a specific sort of custody transfer process for kids that are apprehended at the US Mexico border. But when children are not apprehended and they have to make a life without the government knowing they're around, so not providing services, without any adults that is assigned the care, the legal care of that child, they're really navigating what I argue is unaccompanied status in its true form, right? They're
Hmm.
not just a legal designation, but the experience of being unaccompanied. So I'll say this: what was a 70,000 child crisis? It was about 68 or 69,000 children were apprehended in 2014, and we were shocked, right? That was the crisis in
Right.
2014. In 2021, and since then, we have seen about 140,000 children annually, on average, apprehended at the US Mexico border. So the crisis has doubled in the last decade. Um, and again, that's not accounting for the number of kids who are not apprehended. And I reference in the book a study that was done in the 90s and early 2000s on Mexican undocumented migration.
Right.
And the authors of that study, Douglas Massey, who was a sociologist at Princeton, and his pals wrote a book. It's called Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, and they estimated that at the peak of that crisis, at the peak of that migration flow, for every one Mexican migrant that was apprehended at the border, three others were not. So that's based on population growth once in the US interior, right?
Right.
So I sort of tell people we can't know the full number because we aren't tallying unapprehended children. But if we were to look at Mexican migration, we sort of might assume that we can get into that same range.
Okay. Now when we're talking about migration. You said Mexican migration, but nowadays it's not so much Mexico. It's more Central
Right,
Americans that are coming up.
absolutely.
Why is that?
Yeah, so Mexican migration is at net zero, right? Which means that the same number of people that are entering the US are leaving the US. A part of that is, it's a trend that we started to observe at the onset of the Great Recession.
Okay.
Our economy started to decline, and that was at the same time that the Mexican government was investing in education more.
When you say,
Their economy was growing.
I'm sorry, Stephanie, to interrupt. When you say Great Recession, what year are you talking about? Which?
2008,
Okay,
2009.
2000. Okay, I just want to see.
Yeah.
Okay, your idea of Great Recession and my idea of being much older is two different things. I'm thinking back to Dust Bowl. I'm going, okay, that
Different recession.
different recession. Okay, so from about 2008 is when you're looking. All right, I'm sorry. Just
Yeah.
want to get that clarified.
So, no, so our economy started to decline then, just as the economy and infrastructure started to grow in Mexico.
Okay.
So people started to leave the U.S. and less people started coming into the US from Mexico. And that was right around the same time, as you mentioned, Central American migration started to really increase from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala specifically.
Okay. Now, when we're talking about this migration, I understand the concept of migration and what's going on. But as Mexico is now in net zero, we're talking about a lot of these folks and children, especially for this episode, they cross the entire length of Mexico to get here. How do they do that?
Mm-hmm.
Are they
Yeah,
walking? Are they taking trains, hitchhiking, coyotes?
yeah,
How?
yeah. It's all of it. It's So you're right. Anyone from Central America, if you're from El Salvador, you're crossing El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, then getting to the US. If you're from Honduras, like everyone pretty much has to cross us through Guatemala to get out of Central America.
Mm-hmm.
So multiple borders are being crossed. The journey is much longer, much more expensive, much more treacherous coming through from Central America to the United States. So when you see rates of South American migration now that are increasing, you're imagining people from further, crossing through Central America, crossing through Mexico, and getting to the US. Um, People are doing this, yes, by foot. The young people that I interviewed for the book and that I met in the 6 years of research that I did in Los Angeles, they were coming to the US by raft, by boat, trucks, like embedded in the bottom of trucks,
Mm-hmm.
cars, walking, trains, all of it minus boarding a plane, handing over some paperwork, and hopping off a plane on the other end, right? It really is a matter of surviving the migration journey. A lot of people, there was actually one person that was from Honduras that um, he got Guatemala tattooed around his belly button and sort of arched around his belly button. And he said the purpose of that was that if he were to get stopped in Mexico, they would send him to Guatemala and not all the way back to Honduras, because
Ah,
they would know that he was not
got it.
Mexican, right? From his Spanish accent. But that was a survival mechanism that then he, as an adult, had to get the tattoo removed because he wasn't actually from Guatemala. But there's a sort of knowledge that the journey is much longer, much more difficult, and significantly more financially expensive, right?
Okay.
Because you mentioned the coyotes.
Yeah, I mean it's financially expensive, but when some of these children are coming unaccompanied, and in your research, because I know that just for the audience's sake, your research was one-on-one interviews with a lot of these
Right.
children, or at the time children that crossed over. How do you give? They come as young as how old?
In my research, I met someone who migrated as young as 7. But
7?
yeah, but I did 6 years of observations, church, community gardens, schools. I did observations all across Los Angeles. But in the interviews, the youngest age was 11. Someone that
Okay.
sat down and told me I was 11 years old and this is how it happened. Um, yeah, so but as I was sort of moving in and out of the neighborhoods in LA, I met someone who was as young as 7.
Man, I don't even trust an 11-year-old with a remote control, much less them going on their own. So I'm looking at it from a financial aspect. I mean, these children have to have money with them, I would assume. And I mean, what training, what knowledge do they have of actually how to wisely
Finance
spend?
management.
Yeah, I mean, that's
So this
difficult
is
for adults, much less children.
right. It's impossible for me, and I'm a professor, like PhD holding professor,
Yeah.
right? Like all of the things. But one of the things I really try to set out, and this doesn't mean that it makes it easier for unaccompanied children, but one of the things I really try to make clear is our conceptions of childhood as the readers of the book and as the people experiencing the lives of this, the stories that I tell in the book, is that many of these young people started working as young as 3 or 4 years old. There's one story I tell of a woman, I call her Camelia in the book, and she remembers being 14 years old and she was given a certain amount of money to go to the market. And the day she realized I need to migrate was the day her mom gave her, I think it was 100 quetzales, which it's 7 quetzales for one US dollar at the time. So you do the math on that. But she remembers, like, I went to the market and I was able to buy this many tomatoes, this much meat, like specifically
Hmm.
recalling exactly what she was able to purchase at 14 years old. And on her way home, she thought, wait, this is not survivable. Like, I need to leave. So the money management is part of
It
what
triggered
their
it
triggers the
triggered that
need
desire
to
to go, this is not sustainable.
in the same way that so many of the people I interviewed talked about being in the origin country, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and thinking, if I work this much, because they have Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever, and they're in communication with someone in the US and they're hearing about what the earnings are in the US. So they say, if I work this much for this many years, I will earn this amount of money and I'll return home. Often that meant being in the US for 3 or 4 years, and they imagined having $15,000, $20,000,
Right.
right, in that time. They get here and they realize, well, it's not that much. You're not making that much money, and it is expensive as hell to
Yeah.
live in the US, especially in Los Angeles. So I'm talking to them on average 8.6 years. When I calculated how long all of my participants had been in the US, the average was about 8.6 years. That's almost twice as long as the goal that they set, right?
And they're set that 8.2 years. This is the time they spent working,
Working.
trying to save up to go back home, not to stay, but to go back home.
Oftentimes it was to go back home because, again, they left at 14.
Yeah.
So many people told me, and there's one story I tell specifically of a young man who watched his father's burial in Guatemala on Facebook Live. And he said, I didn't think when I said bye to him when I was 16 that, he's now 28 when he's telling me this story. He didn't think that would be the last time. So there are people that migrate and they imagine that they will, the US is their last stop. But some people migrate also to earn money, to go back home, to start a business, to be more self-sufficient, or to improve the infrastructure of their homes, or to save money here, to finish school there, right? So
Right.
it isn't always just coming here and like so much of the rhetoric we hear is coming here to take advantage of the things
Oh yeah.
and to extract from the US.
And to take my job. I mean,
Yes,
yes, I'm a roofer. I want to work in the Texas heat at 107-degree temperature, doing sheetrock and putting on a roof. Um,
right.
yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. I mean, they come, they want to work, they want to earn enough to go back and reinvest in their own lives back home, helping their families, that whole family tie and everything else. But then, too, I'm sure a good percentage actually end up staying.
Yeah, so that's what I find, right? That, again, on average, 8.6 years later, they're telling me, I thought I was going to go back in 3 years. They end up staying because low wage labor is exploitative. Undocumented people are the most deeply exploited in the US. Children, on top of that, are even more exploitable
Hmm.
because employers know they're not supposed to be there, right? Um, and also, again, the cost of living, it's not just the rent and the food, it's also things. I mentioned this over and over. The young people didn't think they would need quarters to do laundry. They didn't think it cost money to ride a bus across town. They didn't think that everything was going to cost
Right.
money. So people said, aquí se paga todo. You pay for everything. You can't get a stick of gum without pay.
Yeah. True.
So, like, the money is just getting bled out of them, while they're also working 14, 15, 16 hours a day at a restaurant or in a factory, or as a mobile car washer across LA,
And many
right? So,
times being exploited and being paid lower than minimum wage.
of
Um,
course, yes.
yeah.
So there was one young person whose employer at a restaurant asked him, um, his name is, I call him Gael in the book. His employer asked him, how much is your rent? And Gael naively said 280 or whatever the amount was, which, they're renting rooms alongside other people. So rent is
Hmm.
relatively cheap in our minds, right? So the employer would pay him exactly that amount. Here's for your rent, here's for your rent. So what was Gael to do about food and clothes and shoes and
Jeez.
the transportation to get to work? So he had spent years, maybe 3 years in that restaurant, and he had calculated that he had thousands of dollars stolen from him.
Yeah,
right?
obviously, yeah.
Um, and then there's other people in the garment industry. I was just talking to a friend about this. When you see clothes that is really cheap, a t-shirt that's $5, you can assume that someone was paid 50 cents to make that shirt, right?
Hmm.
The cheaper it is for us as consumers, the more exploited the person on the back end was. And more it is children doing that work in the US context.
Wow. You know, you make a good point. These are a lot of things that people don't stop and think at. Or, excuse me, stop and think about. But okay, makes sense. And a lot of this garment industry, we're talking conditions are probably like sweatshops. Just
Absolutely. Yeah, I
okay,
detail it in the book. There's things like the gates, like warehouses, they have those like metal gates that
right,
pull down and they get chained. People would say they get locked behind you. There's no signage on the outside of the factory. It looks like an abandoned building. This is in Los Angeles, right? Like this is central
right.
fashion world in the United States. Sorry to the New Yorkers, but it's also like the heat, it's hot, all the
Oh yeah,
machines
I
are
mean,
running, none of the windows are open. Just
ergo the term sweatshop. I mean, yeah,
yeah,
from exploited children making these garments to go onto the market at a decent price, and God, okay.
yeah.
Here's a question I have. When we're looking at, I'm just every night I almost pray for these kids, that they're going to be safe, but especially for young women, young girls that are traveling unaccompanied. I mean, I can imagine the danger factor just increases tenfold. Other than boys, I mean, you got sexual exploitation, trafficking, slavery. I mean, did you come across any of that in your research?
Yeah. And this is where I have to sort of put a content warning on the conversation, right? Because there were many young people, young women that talked about having been sexually abused in their origin country, and that was one of the motivators for migration.
Okay,
Um, Sexually abused as far as multiple men abusing one woman at the same time, right? On the
right.
migration journey, women arriving pregnant, women arriving just afraid of, there was one woman who was just afraid of men, period. Like she didn't want to speak to, she didn't want anyone to even look at her. So she would talk about only going outside. She couldn't work in the factories. There were too many people around her. She would only go outside for a certain amount of time every day because she couldn't stand thinking that men were looking at her because of how much abuse she'd endured. Um, and you can imagine then if you're not out making friends, developing social ties, accessing information, getting networked, how are you going to find a job? How are you going
Right.
to get anywhere? So she ended up meeting a man in the garment factory who noticed that she was so afraid and said, I'll take care of you. You don't have to work. And then he became abusive and controlling of her because now she was financially dependent on him. So I talk in the book about, there are these experiences of what the young people say, sufrimiento, suffering. And I
Hmm.
try to broadly describe what those experiences are. And then I get into like, well, for indigenous youth, they experience anti-indigenous racism, and that makes the experience look this way. And then for women who are isolated and treated as less than in US society, but also the compounding Latin American and US society, right?
Hmm.
This is their experience. And I try to show how there is both a shared reality for all unaccompanied children, but then there are sort of complexities that arise out of either patriarchal gender norms or ethno-racial discrimination of indigenous people.
Right. Ooh, a lot to think about. Stephanie, what is
Yeah.
in your research? I hear different things, but what's the average? I mean, what does it cost for somebody to go from Central America? I mean, if they had to pay a coyote, what do you have any idea what the average cost is, or how much money they're actually shelling out with no guarantees of even arriving, much less living?
Yeah, yeah. Um, at the time of the research, so I conducted my research between 2012 and 2018. All of my participants had migrated to the US between 2003 and 2013. So in the decade before the crisis of 2014, the unaccompanied child migrant crisis. So on average, the people that I interviewed, would talk about between 8 and 11,000 US dollars. That was to migrate between 2003 and 2013.
Between,
So today,
wow.
8 and 11,000. So children were arriving in Los Angeles with already owing $11,000, right? On top of just needing to survive. So there were many negotiations they had to make about how much they would eat, how many hours they would work, especially if they're getting paid.
Okay, so this isn't necessarily upfront money.
No,
This is
a debt.
this is a
This
debt.
is a debt.
Okay. Because I was saying, man, if I had $11,000 to pay a coyote, I mean, I might as well stay where I'm at and you invest that $11,000 into something.
Yeah, it would be something like they would maybe, it's not called a down payment, but you can imagine
You had
it's
to
like a
pay
down
something.
payment. Here's 2,000, here's 1,000, and then the children come with the debt. Sometimes families would leverage the lands that they had. So there's a lot of stories about kids not being able to, or even adults not being able to pay back the debt fast enough, and then the land gets taken from their families, right? Or people come after whoever the creditors are, the lenders are, would come after the family member. So there's a risk of your family being targeted for violence if you don't pay fast enough. But what I wanted to say is that in 2024, you hear stories of $28,000, $30,000 of debt. 20, like just outrageous numbers. Like you could buy a whole car, and that takes people years on a payment plan, right? And you're asking children to pay this oftentimes to survive, right?
So a lot of their not only are they exploited and underpaid and abused, but if they are fortunate enough to have a decent wage to try to raise a little money other than living expenses, the majority of that money goes back to pay the debt of them even being there. So how many do any of them ever get out from under that thumb? I mean, I know, as we all know, student debt is bad enough, but I can imagine the pressure of coyotes or criminals or whatever going, hey, if you don't pay this, we're going to go kill your parents, or we're going to take your family's land. I mean, that is a lot of pressure on these children.
Yeah. And something I think about is that something like student debt, yes, you're in debt, but it's almost like morally good debt because you went out and you took on, like to better yourself, or so that it's different than migration debt, where if you don't pay it off fast enough, there's a bit of shame that comes with it, right? Like you're not successful in the US, therefore you are still in debt. And that can be really detrimental to young people's sense of self and their well-being. But yes, some people do get out from under at the time of the research. If they're talking about between $8,000 and $11,000, people would say it took about 1.5 to 3 years to pay that off. But there was one person I met who said between rent, food, remittances, money they'd send to their mom in Guatemala, and then repaying the debt, he was left with $5 every week.
Wow. $5.
So that's like,
yeah,
tapped out. And this is someone who was working in the garment factory 16 hours per day, Monday through Saturday, right? And this is what I talk about in the book as like the emotional developmental cost of exploitation, is that children are working nonstop, right? And their bodies are tired. And at the end of the day, they see all they have is $5. And then it becomes sort of a feeling of betrayal, like it hurts their feelings to live this reality, right? Because they are still just 14, 15, 16-year-olds that are trying to understand, like, what is my value? What is my role? And I imagine that would be the case for all of us if we're working ourselves to the bone and we only have $5.
Normal,
it feels awful.
Right? I mean, normal teenagers, teenagers from middle-class families here in the U.S., I mean, they have enough problems as it is, but I can only imagine what it would be like for somebody saying that, the self-esteem, the self-worth. I mean, I'm working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and I got $5 of my own after everything. God, definitely slave labor.
Yes.
Okay.
And they do, some of my participants did describe the work feeling like they were slaves. Se siente como un esclavo, like you feel like you're doing slave work. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
now that you've totally brought me down and have depressed the audience with your sad stories, do you have any?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm kidding. Is there any success stories that you came across? I mean, is there? Give me a shining light of somebody who actually
Yeah,
has made it,
absolutely.
and the odds were with them,
Yeah.
and they got lucky.
Yeah. I dedicate, I knew this would happen with all of my readers. So the last chapter of the book, chapter 6, is dedicated to what it means for these young people, given all of these horrible conditions from origin country to the time that I'm interviewing them. What is the meaning of success? And I would often ask people, what does it mean to be an adult? What does it mean to be a good immigrant? Good in quotes, right? Um, and the chapter on success really outlines this idea that when we hold this population of young people up against the sort of metric of success as college degrees, home ownership, business ownership, wealth accumulation, we can very easily say they're not successful and wipe, just like totally dismiss them as being unsuccessful immigrants. But when you ask teenagers and young adults, what does it mean to be successful to you? They would say things like, it's what I call a subjective success. They would say things like, when I got here, I was alone. I didn't have friends and I was really depressed. And now I have friends that feel like my brothers, right? When I got here, I was poor, like extremely poor, and couldn't pay money, couldn't send remittances. I didn't have enough money to buy clothes or food. And they're saying, and now I've built my mom a home. My brother started a business. All of my siblings finished school and they didn't migrate, right? So being able to prevent more unaccompanied migration was a marker of success. Other young people would say things like, do you know that apartment complex on the corner of so and so intersection? Yes, I helped build that. Like I did that, right? And that becomes a marker of success. So there are ways that both the material, I call it the giving back.
Hmm.
They adopt these giving back narratives. I built this thing. I help my community. I'm embedded in my church. And then there's the emotional maturation. When I was a teenager here, I felt this and that uncontrollable emotions. And now I feel stable. I feel like I got a grip of myself. And that becomes an emotional marker of success. Uh, One of the most sort of impressive success stories is that young person, Gael, who was initially exploited in the restaurant kitchen where his employer told him, what's your rent?
Right.
Um, he talked to me in an interview about having worked in the flower district, the Los Angeles flower market, as an unaccompanied young person, making floral arrangements. And he said, he really enjoyed the creativity of that work. And he wanted to have a flower shop one day. So I finished the work in 2018. I get a text message in 2023, and Gael had invited me to the opening of his shop with some help from community members
His shop.
yeah, with the help of some, had have legal status. Everything was done fairly, but it's his creative vision that is being executed in this store. And he makes flower arrangements, and he has an event, like a floral arrangement events company. And that is, he told me, my mom, she's happy with me. None of my siblings migrated. Everyone finished school. My brother is married now. So there are stories. It takes longer,
Yeah.
right, to find these stories of success. But so my sort of critique is that when we go into a community and we ask yes or no, did you finish school, we miss the lived reality of how success actually is played out and
Hmm.
what it means to individual people. um, so yeah, that's Gael is my sort of shining light of, like, if you have kids who have clear goals, if you have kids that are embedded in community organizations and you invest in their desires, they can get to the other end and have something that, has a running Instagram account and, like, has a whole footprint in Los
Right.
Angeles.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, again, just the thousands upon thousands of children that are suffering and
Yeah.
have made their way to what they thought was going to be a better life, and it's probably in many cases not that much different or worse than what they got out of.
Yeah.
What, Stephanie? how's the U.S. handling these children? What I mean, it seems to me that's a completely different category. Unaccompanied children, when they're actually detained, what's the process that they go through?
Yeah. Children, when they're apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border, there's a web of policies, laws and policies that sort of dictates how they're treated. One of the most significant ones is the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which was signed in 2008. TVPRA determines that children that are from a country with which we share a border, so Canada and Mexico, are immediately returned to their origin country unless they can prove at the time of apprehension a well-founded fear of
Or
persecution.
unless they have a tattoo over their belly button that says
Some other thing, right?
Australia.
Yeah. If children are from a non-contiguous border country, so all of the kids we've been talking about in Central America and beyond, they are immediately protected by TVPRA and taken into federal custody. They're taken first into what we know as like immigration control, Customs and Border Protection, ICE custody. So the Department of Homeland Security initially takes children in, transfers kids to what is the Department of Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services then works to place children with sponsors in the US. So kids are arriving to California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York at the highest rates, right? They're being reunited with family members, with community members, like origin country community members. And the federal government is really working to provide what they call post-release services to these children, case management, all of that.
Are some of the people here in the U.S. pretty good about bringing in some of these kids, or I guess sponsoring them, adopting them? What's the terminology that they use?
Yeah, sponsoring children. What do you mean by pretty good?
I mean,
like providing care?
Yeah, is there enough? Is there enough out there? Is there a shortage in children still looking for sponsors?
There are children that are in long-term foster facilities or long-term facilities because they cannot find the sponsor of that child, for that child, which can mean anything from they don't have family they're the first in their families to migrate and there's no one to connect them to. The child might be too young or too old and people just don't want to take them in, right? Mm-hmm. To become a sponsor, you need to apply, be interviewed, background check,
like
all of that.
Almost like an adoption or a foster care type application. Okay.
So if no one comes forward and says, I want to do this, then the kid, they have to find another way to care for that child. But in the case of the children that we've been talking about from Sin Padres ni Papeles, they're not apprehended. So they're arriving at the doorsteps of people and asking, can you help me? And oftentimes, as I mentioned, they're not just migrating unaccompanied, they're staying unaccompanied because relatives say, no, I can't take you in.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. You gave me something to think about, that measuring success. Yeah, by, I guess, our Western U.S. standards, some of our success is a little bit different. How big is your bank account? Do you have anything in?
Yeah.
How much money do you make? What kind of cars do you drive? All that materialist stuff. And success for some of these children are going like, hey, I'm out of debt. My family is safe. My siblings are safe. They're getting their education. They don't have to come up here and go through what I do. And so it's that sense of giving back and being responsible towards family that measures their success. And I can only imagine some of the psychological issues some of these children are going to have as they get older in life. I mean, that's a lot to go through.
Not even as they get older, in real time.
Yeah. You're right.
Right?
You're right.
Yeah.
I mean, geez. Wow. Yeah. Okay. The name of the book, once again, is Sin Padres ni Papeles. And this is available where, Stephanie? Where can we find the book?
You can find it anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble. I recommend bookshop.org because they ship from local bookstores based on the zip code.
Okay.
So it's always good to support local bookstores. But anywhere you buy books, I would appreciate folks engaging with it.
And do you have a paperback? Do you have a hardback version or just a paperback?
There's a hardback, yes. There's an audio, or there's a Kindle version. My partner wants an audio version, TBD. But yeah, you can get it Kindle, PDF,
Okay.
whatever works for you.
Well,
Yeah.
you know what? I'm enjoying the book so far. And my problem is, I get anxious. I was thumbing through, then I caught something that caught my eye. I was reading about a little girl named Isabella, I think.
Uh-huh.
I started reading about her, and I'm kind of entrenched in that, and I got to go back and finish that. But I go, okay, so I should start from the beginning and not try to just dive into the middle. But thank you so very much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with? Any last words or thoughts?
Yeah. I would like to say one thing, especially because of sort of the messaging we've been hearing around immigrants and immigration over the past few months leading up to the election. But one thing I really want to say is that there are a lot of adults in the room that, say what the solution to these issues are: child migration, child labor. We walk into conversations really having an idea of what children should do or who children should be. One of my hopes for the readers of Sin Padres ni Papeles is that we really slow down and listen to kids' voices, young people's
Sure.
perspectives, what young people want for their lives, and reconsider whether we should develop policies and programs that are reflective of children's lived realities rather,
Then,
a bottom-up approach to
right.
the issue rather than saying this is what we should do and demanding that kids meet us there. That's just not
Yeah. In other words,
human. It's not realistic.
let those policies be determined by, like you said, have the kids have input and not a group of adults who have no experience of what they've
Have
been
never
through,
lived it.
never lived it, and going, this is what's best for you without
Right,
realizing. Okay.
right.
All right.
Yeah.
Wow. Sin Padres y Papeles. It's available everywhere. What I'll do on the podcast notes, I'll do a link to, what was that one that your favorite?
Bookshop.org.
Bookshop.org. Okay, that's where I'll start seeing about buying some of my books. Stephanie, I'm going to get with you a bit later on. I'd be very interested if you would be so kind as to maybe getting the copy hardcover and
Yeah.
you signing it for me. I'll
Yeah.
finish devouring the paperback version, and I was taught not to dog ear, but I just still do every now and then. But I'd love to get a hard copy of that. And Stephanie, not only thank you for taking the time, but thank you for the research. I'm going to encourage people to read it. I'd like to maybe take some excerpts out of this. Do you ever do any writing for like short columns or newsletters or anything on this subject matter?
Sometimes I'll do like a public essay, an op-ed. Yeah.
How about
By invite, yeah.
how about speaking engagements? You ever speak on this subject?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep you in
Yeah.
mind.
Yes.
Stephanie, thank you so very much, and thank you
Thank
for
you.
doing the research. Like I said, I'm anxious to finish the book. Ladies and gentlemen out there, Sin Padres ni Papeles. It's available everywhere. We'll put a link to some of the places you can find it. I definitely recommend it. If you're a person like me who appreciates photos, no, you're not going to be happy. I don't
There's
think
one. There's one photo.
and is it a photo or an illustration? I think you have a couple little
It's a
illustrations in there, but yeah, okay, yeah. So you're not gonna be able to look at the pictures. Stephanie, thank you so very much. Folks, you've been listening to the Latino Business Report. My name is J.R. Gonzalez. I'm your host. Latino Business Report can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts. You also have our complete library of our work on YouTube. And you can also go to latinobusinessreport.com for an entire body of work and more information about the show. Till next time, have a great day. Stay safe. And Stephanie, God bless you.